Once we detonated the first atomic bomb, these civilizations went on high alert that these chimpanzees, known as humans, that had evolved to the point of having enough intellect to extinguish all life on Earth. And so we basically kicked a hornet's nest. Kennedy was the last president to make a serious effort to correct that, and that got him killed, 100%. Humans have a choice to make, and we better make it in the next 18 to 24 months. These various civilizations have been visiting the Earth since before Homo sapiens were here. So in other words, they predate Homo sapiens, humans. And they were of two types. One were ones that were hundreds of thousands of years old that were non-human in origin and were the remnants of visitations going back before recorded history. And the others were of civilizations on Earth that were early human-like civilizations, not extraterrestrial, that were more advanced than we are now, for which we have virtually no record, because we have very little information before about 5 to 10,000 years ago. So there's a lot in there. Now, when you ask about secrecy, this is a recent phenomenon. Once, it was determined by the national security state, and this would have been in the late 1800s, that there were such objects around. This is the Great Airship Scare and other things of the late 1890s. It was determined that this is something of great interest to military and technological interests, where there had been some retrieval of either the bodies or craft of these objects. And of course, the history of that's very much lost. I do know that there are top secret files that are so-called above top secret that date from the late 1800s and early 20th century on UFOs and the extraterrestrial issue. So this then, the really big era of secrecy kicked in the 40s and 50s. And that was because once we detonated the first atomic bomb, a big red flag went over the Earth and over humans. And basically what happened is that these civilizations went on high alert that these chimpanzees, known as humans, that had evolved to the point of having enough intellect, just enough intellect. The fact is that when you cross the nuclear threshold, you have, even for the last 60 years plus, have the ability to extinguish all life on Earth. It's called mutually assured destruction. So in other words, this is something of great concern. So we basically kicked a hornet's nest. And even though these civilizations are decidedly non-hostile, or they would have claimed our clock in August of 1945, precisely 80 years ago, it would have been all over but the shouting, my friend. They're decidedly not hostile, but they are not happy with the path that we've taken over the last 80 years. Roswell, as it turns out, was the only, in 1947, was the only nuclear weapons facility that stored nuclear bombs on Earth. It was the Roswell Army Air Base. And that was the sole place on Earth that had atomic weapons. And that's why there were those three craft that came in. But what happened is that, and we have an FBI memo to J. Edgar Hoover that explains this, that's in our archive, the Disclosure Project Intelligence Archive, which we've spent about $500,000 putting together in the last couple of years, and now everybody can see all this online. DPIarchive.com, if people are making notes, and you can put a link in there. But what happened is that this ended up having Roswell. We detonated through it was hidden in a radar array, an electromagnetic pulse or scalar type weapon that caused these craft to lose their guidance and propulsion systems. And two of them collided together, but there were three that ended up going down. Two were found right away. One was not found until the early 50s in a remote area of New Mexico going northwest in the mountains from Roswell. So we have all this documented, and I've debriefed firsthand witnesses back in the early 90s who worked that operation. But the reason for it, it wasn't just because, Roswell has become sort of cliche, like Area 51, but in reality, it was because, as were the nuclear weapons, the only ones on the planet, I should say atomic weapons, were stored. It was before we had nuclear, which are the thermonuclear weapons, which are much more dangerous, the hydrogen bombs. And so that's how that evolved. So the ETs became very concerned, but this caused a reaction by the national security state of, well, my God, these are here, and they're here trying to stop us from developing these weapons. and slow down the pace, because the ETs were trying to slow down nuclear Armageddon, but our military and national security state wanted to go full speed ahead in the superpower competition with the Soviet Union. And of course, the rest is history, if you know the history of that whole Cold War race with nuclear weapons, etc. Now, this combined at the same time with us going into space. Remember, in 1957, the Russians put Sputnik up, and then a little over a decade later, we put the first man on the moon. My uncle worked for Northrop Grumman his whole career and was on the team that helped design. He was an aerospace engineer. The lunar module, which was that funny-looking machine that took Neil Armstrong to the moon. So this whole history is not really known by the public or by our leaders, because it's been very clandestine and very secret. But really what it was about was a part of the arms race. So you had the nuclear arms race, you had the conventional weapons, you have the things that you hear about in the media. Then you had the covert arms race, which consists of downing and reverse engineering extraterrestrial vehicles and then trying to build copycat devices that look very similar and operate using so-called anti-gravity. It's actually gravity wave control and gravity control. And that's why most of the UFOs people see are, in fact, from Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Skunk Works, Raytheon, etc. They're not of extraterrestrial origin. I'd say maybe 10 or 20% of them are ET now. Most of the ones people see, and they have no idea that this is the case, are actually ours. And those have been used since the late 1950s in all manner of skullduggery. Things such as abductions, staged alien mutilations, psychological warfare operations, all manner of clandestine and criminal activity, including human trafficking, drug running, etc. So now this has all been turned over to federal law enforcement in the United States by my team, and we now have debriefed over 750 whistleblowers, and I'm turning over the top tier of those that are still living over to the investigatory committees in the House and the Senate, but also to the White House and to the people in law enforcement federally. So that's it in a nutshell. But the secrecy evolved mainly because we wanted to know how these things worked, and we didn't want anyone else to know how they worked. And once they discovered the technology behind them, they realized, well, we have to master this and be preeminent. But the organization that was doing that legally under Truman and in the early years of Eisenhower decided to subvert the rule of law and go outside the system. In other words, that organization and collective of what Eisenhower called military-industrial complex folks working in this particular area of national security and science decided to subvert the Constitution here and elsewhere and create their own entity. And that is what happened. So there was basically a silent and unacknowledged coup d'etat that happened around 1956, 7, 8, when Eisenhower got betrayed by that group. And it has never been put right since. The current president and other presidents I've dealt with have had no control over that organization. Yeah, it actually happened in 1956 near Muroc, M-U-R-O-C, California, which is where Edwards Air Force Base is now, at the high desert. And there was a meeting, I've had it confirmed from the Ministry of Defense in France, ironically, that had information on it, because I was working with an admiral with the French Ministry of Defense about 15 years ago, who sent over a report based on someone who was actually there. That's in my archive somewhere. But the archive is terabytes and terabytes of stuff. I mean, it would take you 2 or 3 years to go through it in a cursory way. But and it's online, so available to anyone who wants to see it. Of course, nobody reads anymore, do they? So it's kind of a moot point. I say that only half jokingly. So at any rate, I know I'm a tough professor, So what happened was that this meeting was because in 1954, here's an important date, October 1954, we mastered what's called gravity control. And we went from the nuclear era to being able to do some extraordinary things with space, time, and matter. So believe it or not, in the 50s, we had the ability to teleport things. We had the ability to master gravity, so objects could basically go beyond the normal aerodynamic and propulsion systems to electromagnetic field propulsion. And that all happened. And of course, the ETs were very concerned because while they don't want to interfere or be at all aggressive, because they're not, they also knew that you had a bunch of sociopaths, and some of them are psychopaths, who had reverse engineered extraterrestrial technologies enough that they were able to then combine that and go out and increasingly be a threat in space. So before we landed on the moon, believe it or not, it's true, we went out with a covert man-made UFOs. Those are actually there's a artist's illustration of 3 of them that were in a hangar for a covert air show in 1988 at Norton Air Force Base in California. We have someone who was there who gave full testimony about being there at that event. And the 3 that you see there in 88, were actually built in the late 50s, early 60s. Because inside the avionics, let's call it, were from the Mercury era, the Mercury capsule. But they had been all through the solar system. They weren't interstellar. They weren't at that level, but they could go out and all around and had been out and back. So we have had man-made UFOs since the late 50s. So the ETs were very concerned that we were not only pushing from atomic weapons to thermonuclear ones when we detonated the first atomic bomb in 1952, hydrogen bomb. They also knew that we were going very quickly, covertly, into these technologies that could eventually be a threat to other worlds and to other people. So now we escalated from being a threat to ourselves to being a threat to others, while also being sort of insane, as a bunch of unstable primates. Humans are a very dangerous species. And there are many beautiful things about humans, but there's this other end of it, right? If you doubt it, look at the human history and all the wars and what's going on right now. We're on the brink of another risk of nuclear war with Ukraine, Russia, and Europe and the United States. So this is looked at very... there's a great deal of concern about this. So that existed in the 50s. And so there was an outreach, and the ETs did meet apparently with Eisenhower and some of his people. And they were suggesting, the ETs, that we stop the nuclear arms race, become peaceful as a people. And the new technologies that had been discovered would give us a world without oil, gas, coal. Poverty would be eliminated in 15 to 20 years. And Eisenhower was inclined to go along with that. The military industrialists, who are tied in the keyword corporate industrialists, didn't want that because it would terminate Standard Oil. It would, which is ExxonMobil, it was, the Standard Oil. It would terminate public utilities. It would terminate nuclear power. It would terminate solar and wind. It would terminate hydroelectric. Everything that runs the planet today that existed in the 50s would be redundant, obsolete, like a old Royal typewriter or a horse and buggy before the Model T. So I think that there was this really critical point where we made some very bad choices. Eisenhower was old and he was tired after having been a 5-star general in World War II. He trusted people who betrayed him. And the result was this military-industrial cabal ran with this, and he got blocked from controlling the projects. I know people who worked with him. They're now dead. But if you look at our witnesses and the testimony of Stephen Lovkin, who was a lawyer, but at the time was in the White House Signal Corps communications in the late 50s until Eisenhower left office. He said that Eisenhower had been pushed aside and didn't control the matter. Kennedy was the last president to make a serious effort to correct that, and that got him killed. 100%. We know this is why he was killed. Fact. It's not a speculation. But the issue then becomes, if you have a group of people with technologies that are way more advanced than a B-2 stealth bomber, and they pretty much run as their own entity, that organization between the late 50s and now you were talking, almost 70 years, has immense power and corrupt power that trumps, no pun intended, that the power of the White House or Congress or any other country. So this is not a conspiracy theory, it's a fact. And the good news is there are members of Congress now and people in law enforcement at a federal level, very high, who now know that is the case, and they are trying to get it corrected. Here's the problem. How do you do that safely now that we have technologies that target ET craft when they enter our dimension? So when they come out of, say, trans-dimensional space-time, we can get into this in a moment, and they become 3D, they are immediately detected, and they are immediately targeted, and they are often downed with these very high-powered quantum potential weapons that are faster than the speed of light, involving scalar and electromagnetic pulses. Now, I was just I've been out at a couple of bases where we have downed dozens of these ET craft. And I've had one of the senior operators take me in his chopper over the classified areas and have shown us the technologies that are used to down these craft. That information has been turned over to the White House and law enforcement, and also the Senate Intelligence and Armed Services and the House Oversight Committee, because I have the video and the photos of these facilities. And if you go to our archive, you'll see we have a map that shows where these bases are and where the underground openings are, because the really important assets are all underground, right? The really key assets are underground, and we know where those openings are for not all facilities, but for enough.
Is there 100% confirmation of humans downing extraterrestrial crafts or UFOs?
100%, yes. In fact, anybody wants to get it, we just released this. And this book has got dozens of cases with named, none of them are anonymous, named witnesses of the downing and retrieval of ET craft. The only ones that are not named are some of the new whistleblowers that do not want to be known publicly, that are been handed over to investigators at a federal level whose information is in there. And all of these cases are illustrated. There's the testimony and the synopsis. So what you have is on one page, you'll have, for example, an image. You'll have an image on one page, and then you'll have the text on the other. And the purpose of this was to have something that someone could flip through. You get a hardcover or paperback from our site. If you go to drstephen.greer.com, you can find that. But those cases are rock solid, and so yeah, it has been proven. Now, getting your hands on that equipment, now that's another matter. We are advising a strike team, the guys who've been special forces, who have separated from the military, who are preparing to go to these sites and retrieve these objects when they get the green light to do so. I have no official standing. I'm a private civilian, but I'm a private civilian who, I'll say this, is not very modest, knows way more about this subject than the President of the United States or the Congress ever will. They don't have time to go into that kind of depth. But I've agreed to advise and give all the information I have to these folks who seriously want to create a correction to this terrible problem that evolved from the 50s onward. And then also, eventually, we hope the technologies that can be safely released would give us a civilization without any poverty or pollution. Now, people, if you want to see a summary of that, a couple years ago, we released a documentary called The Lost Century. And you can see it on Amazon Prime and Tubi and all the sites. And it documents 100 years. That's what we call it, the lost century, of lost technology and human evolution because of the sequestration and suppression of these advanced technologies that would replace everything we're using, right? So imagine, if you had something that's the size of that book that would fit in a closet in your house that would generate all the energy you needed for your home, not tied to the grid, and with zero pollution and zero cost. That is not a utopian pipe dream. Those technologies exist. So the question is, who's going to bring them out? And how do you do that without getting assassinated? Because I know many of the people who have had those technologies that I've gotten to know have been assassinated.
Is there confirmed technology that we are using today that comes from extraterrestrials? And what is the Secrecy Act of 1951? And how does that relate to today's experience?
Yeah, I was on Patrick David's podcast, and he was in Fort Lauderdale, where Billy is, Billy Carson. Yeah. And he asked to talk about this. Here's what happened. About the time that we realized that these technologies would be disruptive to the status quo of the power elite, right? The real oligarchs that run the planet, way above the pay grade of a president or a Congress. Those corrupt enterprises rammed through a number of provisions, one of which was the ability to seize and put national security orders on technologies they deemed of significance to the national security. Well, that's a term that you can be used for anything you just don't want the public to know about. And, is it really in the public interest that we destroy the biosphere? Is it really in the public interest that 3 billion people on the planet don't even have energy to cook their food, so they're cutting down rainforests? No, it is not in the public interest. It's in the interest of the mega hundreds of trillions of dollars in assets that certain organizations control. We're not talking about billions here. We're talking about hundreds of trillions or quadrillions that are at stake.